Kenya is shaken by mass demonstrations against proposed tax hikes. Protesters accuse the president of failing to live up to his election promises, but the government says the finance bill is needed to pay off debt. Will the unrest be contained, or will it escalate even further? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. It all started with peaceful protests against a finance bill tabled in Kenya's parliament that includes tax increases to raise extra funds the government says it needs to pay off public debt. The protests intensified. Crowds stormed the parliament compound and the military was deployed. Security forces used live rounds, killing and injuring many. A defiant President William Ruto called the demonstrations treasonous and promised to take a tough stance on what he called anarchy. We will discuss what options the Kenyan government has as public anger grows. But first, this report by Ibtisam Genford.
Ruto must go!
Protesters calling on President William Ruto to resign from inside Kenya's parliament. They stormed the compound where MPs passed a controversial finance bill that includes tax increases. Local media say MPs were evacuated through an underground tunnel. Moments later, one of the buildings was ablaze. Demonstrations had begun peacefully, organized on social media and led by young people.
Our future is in our own hands. If we actually let them direct us on how we're going to, on how they're going to direct in this country, it's going to be war unto us, and we're not going to let that happen.
Police responded with tear gas, water cannon, and live ammunition. The military was deployed, and the president described some of the protesters as treasonous.
Reject finance bill!
Petitioning of public authorities by a section of law-abiding citizens of the Republic of Kenya was infiltrated and hijacked by a group of organized criminals.
The government says the finance bill will bring in much-needed funds to pay off public debt, currently at 70% of gross domestic product. It hopes to raise $2.7 billion. But critics say ordinary people are paying the price for the heavy spending by state officials, and that raising taxes on property, fuel, and small businesses will only worsen the cost of living crisis.
Everyone is coming out, because we are tired. People are tired, people are hungry, people are unemployed, and you keep pushing the punitive taxes. No one is sponsoring this, okay? You cannot sponsor this much anger. The anger is organic.
More mass action is planned, and protesters say they won't settle for anything less than the bill being scrapped once and for all. Ibtisam Genford, Ajazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Nairobi is Hassan Khanenje, Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, a research and policy think tank based in the Kenyan capital. In Johannesburg is Weston Chilaho, an international relations scholar at the University of the Witwatersrand and author of the book Political Power and Tribalism in Kenya. And also in the Kenyan capital is Otsieno Namwaya, the East Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. Very warm welcome to all of you. Hassan, I'll start with you in Nairobi. President William Ruto was elected 2 years ago on a promise of helping the poor. Has he let them down?
I think there's a sense, especially among the so-called hustlers, that the promises have not been fulfilled. I think part of it is informed by the increasing cost of living, as well as the state of helplessness as a result of increasing employment. Now, some of these factors may not exactly be Ruto's making. Some of it has to do with the vagaries of international economics, as well as the local conditions that have been constrained by other factors, outside on Kenya's control. However, I think there is increasing hopelessness as a result of increasing economic difficulties and social despondency, not just within the country, but actually within the region.
I do want to talk about exactly why Kenya is at this point that it's at now beyond, the latest finance bill. Weston, how much of it is because Kenya has to pay back international lenders, China, the International Monetary Fund, and how much of it is it because of years of corruption and mismanagement that the people on the street say they shouldn't have to be punished for?
Thank you so much, Liz. I think the finance bill, controversial as it is only but the trigger. Kenyans that are poured onto the streets across the country are protesting against decades of grand corruption, of decadence amongst the political elite, of impunity. And your previous speaker said this state of affairs predates William Ruto's presidency, such that for the last 60-odd years, basically the duration under which Kenya has been independent, the political elite have related to the state as a site for personal accumulation, personal enrichment, and have marginalized ordinary people. So Kenyans have been angered by the finance bill because of its punitive measures. It's going to impoverish them further. It's going to increase poverty. There are no jobs. These young people have no jobs. They finished college. Traders are complaining that the taxes are making them basically get nothing out of their efforts. So it's a concatenation of factors which have found expression through the finance bill, which the government and specifically President William Ruto insists on pushing down the Kenyan throats, despite Kenyans having expressed opposition against this bill.
Okay. Otsieno, what do you make of how the government, the president, has handled the protests so far? When he did address the nation, he said that the protests have been hijacked by infiltrators and criminals. Is there any evidence that, what he calls criminals or even people that have interests other than protesting against the taxes have in any way taken over the protests or have a significant presence?
Thank you. Let's remember that yesterday's protests are a culmination of the protests that have been going on since last week. So the same protests were there last week on Thursday, and the protesters had said they will continue with those protests to yesterday and then tomorrow. And tomorrow was basically, they were saying they would go all the way to State House, that's the office of the president. If you remember last week, the protests were very, very peaceful from start to the end. And yesterday, the protests were very peaceful until a few things started happening. One, the police started firing tear gas into the unarmed protesters. And then the second thing, I think the government had organized counter protests by other people, another group that was supporting the finance bill. And the Minister for Interior, Kindiki Kithure, on Monday asked the protesters to allow the others who are supporting the bill to also protest alongside them. I think that was a mistake, because when such a thing happens, there's always going to be a conflict. And so the two things, the police provocatively firing tear gas and then later on starting to use live ammunition against protesters, and then the counter protests, which deliberately made the situation worse. But then something else happened. The members of parliament defiantly went ahead and passed the bill, despite people reaching out to them and requesting them not to.
Otsieno, it sounds like you are saying, pretty much what you're saying is the government is responsible for the violence by shooting on protesters, by organising counter-protests and by passing a bill that so many people are against. Hassan, what do you make of who is out on the streets? There doesn't seem to be, from what we can tell, a political, a religious, tribal, ethnic, regional dimension to these protests and protesters. How much of a challenge does that pose? If that is indeed the case, how much of a challenge is it for the government that these are the common people protesting over bread and butter issues?
it's always easy to deal with an identifiable enemy with a command and control structure. Now, when you're dealing with a group that is spontaneous and extremely widespread, organized, but without a definable structure to be able to deal with, it becomes increasingly difficult. And I think that is why the security services have been overwhelmed, in part because you are having protests across more than 30 counties are going on simultaneously at the same time. But also it is the kind of protest that cuts across ethnic or political religious lines. And that becomes also very hard to be able to deal with. But now, one thing that has happened is the protesters have managed to shape the discourse as well as control the narrative. Now, the government is reacting to a situation where the opposition right now has taken the initiative and the position of the protesters, made up mostly of young people, famously known as Generation Z, at least here in Kenya. And so it is extremely difficult for the government to actually respond to this. Now, outside fairly messaging that is going to speak towards compromise, like information coming out in the media right now is that there is a move towards perhaps revisiting the finance bill itself. It's going to be increasingly difficult to be able to pacify these protesters, especially considering the kind of tensions and the kind of sentiment they're raising and to the extent that are extremely widespread across the country, like nothing else we have seen before.
That's a very interesting point about compromise. Western's several of the most contentious taxes, including levies on bread, women's menstrual products, children's nappies, had all been dropped before the bill was passed. So the government did compromise on some things, and yet the anger not only remained, but intensified. So what are the taxes that remain, and why are people still so angry?
I think the people are still angry because they don't trust the government. They think, and quite correctly, that the government had to insert some of those provisions in the bill because they anticipated the backlash. And then once the backlash, is expressed, they will pull out those provisions to try and placate the Kenyans. The Kenyans saying, no, they will not be hoodwinked. The bill contains a lot of punitive measures that basically touch on virtually everything, whether it's agriculture, whether it's trade, whether it's in people's incomes. Basically, Kenyans are saying they are taxed to the bone. This bill intends to tax them to the bone, and yet their incomes are not rising. There are no jobs for young people. Farmers have no incomes for their efforts. So the anger, Liz, it's because William Ruto, when he was on the stamp campaigning, he campaigned as Mr. Fix-It, that he understood the problems and the challenges bedeviling Kenyans. And he was very specific in his manifestos. The manifestos were region-specific, and he went and listened to Kenyans and took notes. So they are wondering how come he is at sea. He's responding to the very, very things that he campaigned on, and successfully so. He, for instance, promised to take an audit of the previous regime, of which he was part.
Of course, he was the deputy. He was the deputy president for 10 years. Yes. Gentlemen, we have some fascinating breaking news coming into us that I'm just being told about in my ear, which is that President William Ruto has said he will not sign this bill into law. Parliament approved it. It had to be signed by the president. And we're just hearing William Ruto saying that he will not sign this bill. Otsieno, how much is this a victory for protesters? Will they trust this? Will it be the end of protests?
One of the things I've been saying is that the finance bill was just a trigger. And the reason why things got to where they got today, yesterday, is that people have been angered by a number of things that they have been seeing in this administration. One of which is high borrowing, a lot of debt, which people cannot see what it is doing. And people have been asking, in the previous government, they would borrow, but we'll see what they're doing. This one, they're borrowing, but we don't see where the money is going. The second is, of course, what people have mentioned, the unfulfilled promises. And then the high level of corruption. Daily, there are reports of corruption and the money just be getting lost. And the finance bill itself and the budget itself is allocating money to areas that are not necessary, while also removing provisions to areas that people feel considered important. And then the arrogance and the opulence that the people in government suddenly show, where people are asking, where is this money coming from? And people are saying, this is the money that we are being taxed. People are just using that money to lie in their pockets. And it's a much, much bigger discussion, if you listen to what Kenyans are saying, than just the finance bill. And these finance bill protests have not just started today. Last year, there were similar protests about last year's finance bill, which the president forcefully passed and continued to tax people and came up with other legislations which targeted people's salaries and payslips. And Kenyans are now paying up to 40 to 45% of their salary to the government as taxes.
Absolutely. We have seen a number of new taxes. We have seen an increase in taxes since President Ruto came to power 2 years ago. Hassan, what do you make of this news that, William Ruto is saying he's not going to sign this bill, and what Otsieno was saying, talking about the much bigger problems over decades in Kenya of corruption, of mismanagement? Could this be the beginning of the government looking at those much deeper problems?
Beyond the president's promise not to sign this bill, he's actually just concluding a press conference, has also offered to engage the protesters in a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder kind of approach to ensure that the young people are listened to. Now, it is an attempt, at the escalation, but also I think an opportunity to have a more comprehensive, approach towards some of the issues that have plagued the country. And of course, corruption, as well as sometimes, incidents of bad governance, have marred the Kenyan political discourse and affected even the ability of the economy to actually grow, that have contributed or conspired to the kind of environment we see right now being led by the young people, who are more disproportionately affected by bad economy, considering that either some of them are going to school or they're out of school, but they have no job and they have no hope. And that's a very dangerous kind of environment to have within the country.
Weston, how do you see this playing out? I mean, what options does the Kenyan government have? Does it have, if it's not going to pass this bill, what does it have to say to the International Monetary Fund and China to get around the debt that it does have?
Well, first and foremost, regarding the developing story, it's unfortunate, Liz, that it had to come to this, that lives had to be lost. From the Kenyan media, over 25, we don't know the real figure of young people who are extrajudicially shot dead yesterday. It did not have to come to this, because Kenyans had expressed their discontent against the bill. So the kind of things that President Ruto is engaging currently, in terms of he's not going to assent to the bill, he's going to look for a structured dialogue with these young people, it's a moot point. Because to me, he has lost legitimacy. He has lost legitimacy because he appreciates the concerns of the Kenyan citizenry, having been a seasoned politician for the last 30 years plus, and having campaigned on a transformation agenda. He has betrayed the Kenyan electorate, the Kenyan people. So I think. But
he's not signing. But Weston, he's not signing the bill. So has he betrayed the Kenyan people? Has he lost legitimacy? Is he not going to regain some of that legitimacy? Is this not an indication that he has listened to the people?
I don't think, Liz. I don't think. He didn't have to come to this, Liz, because of the recalcitrance. There was no point for the recalcitrance, the destruction of property, the maiming of these young people, and the extrajudicial executions. The security apparatus, he promised that under his watch, his presidency, the police will not engage in extrajudicial and summary executions. We've had Gestapo-like abductions for young people. So I think going forward, that is if he manages to, run through his 5-year term, come next elections, he will have really an uphill task when it comes to re-election. because majority of Kenyans, as we speak now, they may not know who they will vote for come next elections. But I don't think they will be keen to vote for his re-election. I don't think. He squandered a good way.
Well, that is a long way away. And of course, they say that a week is a long time in politics. The next election is 3 years away. Otsieno, how bad exactly did things get? You know, Weston is talking about what he's calling extrajudicial killings. We've heard of journalists being injured. We've heard of a doctor who was helping the protesters dying from a gunshot wound. So just how bad did things get? How worried would President William Ruto be about how things look, not just to Kenya, but with the United Nations commenting on what's happening and Kenya's image?
Well, from the reports we are getting, it's not looking really good. We have not confirmed a lot of things, but what we are hearing, some of the killings that happened in Nairobi around Parliament at around 5 p.m., and then other killings that happened at Parliament around 3 p.m. There are scores of people who died. I think around 3 p.m. there were about 8, 5 p.m. nobody knows, but could be over 10. But those numbers are yet to be confirmed. There were killings around Githurai at night by the military. And there are reports of killings in other parts of the country that we haven't confirmed. I think when the confirmation, people finally get confirmed what has really happened during these protests, I think it could also add another dimension to the protests. Secondly, the deployment of the military and snipers yesterday, I think it was the first time that Kenyans have seen the government deploying snipers to deal with unarmed protesters. Snipers were all over Parliament, and quite a number of the killings, including of the police officers themselves, who are actually being done by the snipers at Parliament. And the killings that happened in parts of Githurai were by the military from Kahawa Barracks. And there are quite a number of people. There were killings at around 5. It could be 20 or more than 20 people. And then there were killings at 10 p.m., which went on to around 5, and nobody knows the number.
Okay, certainly very worrying reports that we will no doubt have confirmation of over the coming days. Hassan, what does President William Ruto and the government do now? Is there a way for them to please the people out on the streets, 30% of whom are living in poverty, who say they cannot afford an increase in the cost of living, and the international lenders?
First, it's going to take a form of strategic communication that communicates the willingness to stand down on some of the issues and to come down to the ground to meet the protesters. I think this is something that we can see that the presidency is trying to do. They just concluded a press conference, speaking and alluding to that. A little bit different from the tone that I think the country had yesterday that, raised certain concerns with regard to the government's willingness to compromise. But number two, to seriously perhaps establish a task force to look into the kind of concerns and grievances, but as well as come up with practical steps of dealing with issues such as corruption, mismanagement of the economy. This is something that goes way back. It didn't start with the current administration, as well as the general attitude that leaders and politicians have towards, citizens, especially the Gen Z generation, which they did not, politicians don't seem to really understand very much. But fundamentally, it's going to be about the economy. And if there is a possibility that there are going to be policies that, number one, factor in the interests of the country as well as the citizens, but also in the direction of actually reviving the economy to be able to provide hope and employment as well as job opportunities for the young people, then it can go a long way in ameliorating the kind of challenges the government is facing, but also in restoring the kind of legitimacy the government needs to be able to function. Because outside or in the absence of sufficient legitimacy, it is very, very hard to be able to manage and control a country and population.
And Weston, I know that you think the government has lost a lot of legitimacy in how it's handled these protests, but does it have a fiscal repair plan? Does it have the external support to manage this crisis? Can it get it together, in your view?
Well, they can, if if they exercise political will, they can leave. Because you asked, what will they do? Because they are supposed to raise money, external lenders are piling pressure. Yeah. But Kenyans are saying, no, the money that the Kenyan government has borrowed, it's ended up in people's pockets. Kenyans are saying that corruption is way too rampant in the government. There's a lot of wastage. The government asks Kenyans to live within their limits, but the government officials are living large, spending a lot of money on luxuries, on travel, but at the same time asking Kenyans to exercise austerity measures. President William Ruto must know that he's accountable to the people of Kenya. He's not accountable to external lenders. He's not accountable to the IMF or the World Bank. And I think if he was to engage these Bretton Woods institutions and tell them this, the Kenyan people will not take it. They will have to find a way out. One of your speakers is talking about a task force. I don't think we need a task force lead. Task forces in Kenya are meant to manage anxiety. These issues are known. The issues of corruption, of poverty, inequalities, a flawed judicial system, which has really been unfair to young people. They are asking for these things to be reformed. A criminal justice system that is responsive to their needs, an economy that works and gives them jobs, an education system that works where they get quality education, a healthcare system. You don't need
Weston,
a task force.
that is certainly what the people out on the streets have been asking for. We've only got about 1 minute left in the programme, and I would like to hear from Otsieno, given everything that's at stake, what people are asking for, this, President Ruto saying he's not going to sign this bill. Are you hopeful for this moment in Kenya, for the country and for the people?
Let's hope that not signing the bill is the beginning, because one of the problems that I think I've seen the protesters complaining about is the feeling that they're not being heard, and the protesters are just representing most of the Kenyans. This bill, before it got where it got, I think people had presented memorandums. There was public participation process where over 90% of Kenyans outrightly rejected the bill. The investors said, if you pass this bill, we shall leave Kenya. But the parliament and the president went ahead and passed the bill. There were reports of people being bribed in parliament up to as much as 2 million shillings. MPs were saying they were being given 2 million shillings to pass the bill. And these issues, alongside the compromising of all institutions of governance, such as parliament, investigative authorities like IPOA, those are issues that need to be sorted, because people are concerned that the government is no longer functioning as government. It has become a one-man show. I think institutions are allowed to work.
We have run out of time, but thank you to all of our guests on this fast-moving and developing story as we're recording. That is Hassan Khanenje in Nairobi, Weston Shilaho in Johannesburg, and Ostieno Namwaya in Nairobi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.